The first time they fined my service dog, I honestly thought it had to be some kind of paperwork mix-up. The second notice made me nervous. By the third one, I realized someone wanted me gone. My name is Emily Parker. I'm 46 years old, and until a few years ago I had a pretty ordinary life in Spokane, Washington. I spent almost 15 years working as a records compliance specialist for a regional healthcare network. One of those behind-the-scenes jobs where nobody notices you unless something goes terribly wrong. My entire career revolved around details, timestamps, signatures, document histories, audit trails. It wasn't glamorous, but I was good at it. Then came the neurological condition that changed everything. Some mornings, my legs cooperate. Some mornings, they don't. My hands occasionally lose feeling without warning. And if I'm lucky, I get enough notice before an episode to sit down somewhere safe. If I'm not lucky, well, that's where Hazel comes in. Hazel is my golden retriever, officially trained as a medical alert service dog. She doesn't bark much, doesn't jump on people, doesn't beg for food. What she does is quietly press her nose against my arm about 2 minutes before one of my episodes starts. And those 2 minutes have probably saved me from more emergency room visits than I can count. When I moved into the Cedar Ridge condominiums, I made absolutely sure every piece of paperwork was perfect. My neurologist wrote a detailed letter. Hazel's certification was included. The lease clearly stated that reasonable accommodations would be provided under federal law. The property manager reviewed everything, smiled, and even scratched Hazel behind the ears before saying, "Welcome home." I remember driving away from that leasing office thinking maybe life was finally slowing down. Maybe I had found somewhere peaceful enough to rebuild after everything my illness had taken from me. For about 2 weeks, I actually believed it. Then one Thursday afternoon, I opened my front door and found a bright orange violation notice taped right in the middle of it. $250. Unauthorized pet. I actually laughed. I walked back inside, grabbed my accommodation approval, and figured I'd clear it up with one phone call. Nobody answered. I left a voicemail. The next morning, another notice appeared. Another $250. By Monday, there were 4 notices sitting in my mailbox, stacked together like somebody wanted to make sure I saw every single one. That's when I met Linda Mercer, the HOA president. Everyone in the complex knew her. She was one of those people who somehow managed to walk fast and look disappointed at the same time, always carrying a clipboard like it was some kind of royal scepter. The neighbor across from me whispered one afternoon while checking his mail, "Don't argue with Linda. She loves making examples out of people." I smiled politely, but I figured nobody could possibly have a problem with a federally protected service dog. I underestimated both Linda and the strange little kingdoms some people build once they're handed a tiny amount of power. She knocked on my door Tuesday morning wearing sunglasses bigger than my face and barely glanced at Hazel before saying, "You need to remove the animal immediately." I calmly explained that Hazel wasn't a pet and handed her copies of every document I'd already submitted. She didn't even look down. She folded the papers in half, pushed them back toward me, and said, "People print things off the internet every day." I blinked because I honestly wasn't sure I'd heard her correctly. "Excuse me." She crossed her arms. "People fake disabilities all the time. We have to protect the community." That sentence stayed with me long after she walked away. Not because it made me angry, although it certainly did, but because of how casually she said it, like she'd already decided exactly who I was without reading a single page. Over the next several days, the fines kept coming. $250. $250. Then an additional $150 for what they called intimidating behavior, because Hazel supposedly made another resident uncomfortable simply by standing beside me in the hallway. Hazel hadn't barked, growled, or even looked at anyone. She had been carrying my medication pouch in her vest while I struggled to unlock my front door. By the end of the week, according to the HOA, I owed nearly $2,000. I sat at my kitchen table staring at the stack of violation notices while Hazel rested her head on my knee. And for the first time in months, I felt something besides fear. I felt curiosity. The notices didn't look right. Something about the formatting, the dates, the sequence, little inconsistencies most people would never notice. My old career had trained my brain to catch patterns the way mechanics hear engine noises other people miss. I spread every notice across the dining room table, lined them up by date, grabbed a yellow legal pad, and started making notes. At first, I was simply trying to understand how this had spiraled so quickly. But about 20 minutes later, I stopped writing, leaned back in my chair, looked at Hazel sleeping peacefully beside the table, and quietly said to myself, "Linda, I don't think you've been following your own rules." And that was the exact moment this stopped being a fight over a service dog and became an investigation. The next morning, I skipped breakfast, made a pot of coffee I barely touched, and turned my dining table into something that looked more like an evidence room than a place where normal people ate dinner. Hazel curled up beside my chair, occasionally lifting her head whenever I sighed too loudly, almost like she knew I was putting together a puzzle that mattered more than either of us fully understood. I started with the violation notices, then added every email I'd exchanged with the property management company, every maintenance request, every HOA newsletter, even the welcome packet they'd given me when I moved in. People usually think investigations begin with dramatic discoveries, but they don't. They begin with patience, with staring at boring documents until the boring parts start telling different stories. By lunchtime, I'd already noticed something strange. According to one violation notice, an unnamed resident had complained about Hazel on a Tuesday evening at 7:40 p.m., but the violation itself had supposedly been approved and signed at 3:15 that same afternoon. That made absolutely no sense. You can't respond to a complaint before the complaint exists. I double-checked the dates 3 times, convinced I was overlooking something obvious, but the numbers never changed. Then I found another one. A violation issued on a Sunday morning, except the HOA office wasn't even open on Sundays. Their own website said office hours were Monday through Friday. Maybe someone had remote access. I thought, maybe. But then I remembered something from my years working compliance audits. When mistakes happen naturally, they're usually random. When the same impossible mistake repeats itself, someone is creating it. That realization sent a chill down my spine, because suddenly this wasn't just about me anymore. If Linda had fabricated notices against me, who else had she done this to? I started knocking on a few neighbors' doors, carefully, politely, not accusing anyone of anything. Most people looked nervous the second I mentioned the HOA. One older gentleman named Frank quietly invited me inside after checking his hallway twice like he expected someone to be watching. He showed me 3 violation notices he'd received over the previous year, all for things he'd already fixed before the notices were supposedly written. I figured I was just getting old, he admitted with an embarrassed smile. Thought maybe I remembered the dates wrong. A young couple down the hall had something similar. Their notice claimed trash cans were left outside for 4 days. Yet the attached photograph clearly showed Christmas decorations, taken almost 6 weeks earlier. They paid the fine simply because fighting the HOA sounded exhausting. One woman actually laughed when I asked if she'd challenged Linda. "Nobody wins against her," she said. "People just move away." That sentence bothered me all afternoon. Nobody wins against her. Somewhere along the way, everyone had accepted that as normal. I hadn't. Not because I was particularly brave, but because I literally couldn't afford not to fight. Between my medical bills and reduced income after leaving my career, nearly $2,000 in fabricated fines wasn't an inconvenience. It was catastrophic. So I kept digging. Late that evening, I examined digital copies of the notices I downloaded from the HOA resident portal. Most people never think about metadata, but documents leave fingerprints just like people do. Creation dates, edit histories, file properties, hidden details buried underneath what you actually see on the page. One notice claimed to have been created on April 12th, but its digital history showed it had actually been modified almost 3 weeks later, after 2 additional violations had already been issued. Another document contained the exact same electronic signature file used on a completely different notice, right down to the pixel dimensions. Linda hadn't signed each notice individually. Someone had copied and pasted signatures onto pre-written forms. I leaned back in my chair and laughed quietly, not because it was funny, but because I suddenly recognized the pattern. During hospital audits, we'd occasionally catch employees altering patient records after incidents occurred. The alterations were never perfect because people always focused on what others would see. They forgot about what computers remembered. Computers are terrible liars. They remember everything. The following afternoon, Linda showed up again, this time without knocking. She simply stood outside my patio while I watered a few potted flowers. Hazel light, sniffing every morning. "Have you removed the animal?" she asked flatly. I had already slipped my phone into my pocket with the voice recorder running. Not because I expected a confession, but because I'd learned years ago that people often reveal themselves when they think nobody is documenting the conversation. I smiled politely. "Actually, I was hoping you could explain why my accommodation paperwork isn't being honored. She rolled her eyes so dramatically I almost expected them to fall onto the sidewalk. I don't have time to review every stack of medical papers people hand me. I paused. So you didn't review mine? I glanced at it, she answered. That doesn't mean I have to believe everything doctors write. There it was. Calm, casual, unforced. She had just admitted she ignored documentation she'd already approved. I asked one more question. Then why did the HOA send me written approval before I moved in? She frowned for half a second before answering. That was probably the management office. We clean up their mistakes all the time. She turned around and walked away without realizing she'd just contradicted the very foundation of every violation she'd issued. Hazel nudged my hand with her nose, almost like she sensed my heartbeat speeding up. I stopped the recording and listened to it twice before going back inside. Every word was crystal clear. But one recording wasn't enough. I wanted something impossible to dismiss. Over the next several days, I requested copies of board meeting minutes, violation procedures, accommodation policies, and archived community notices. The management office complied surprisingly quickly. Later, I learned why. The property manager, Melissa, quietly pulled me aside one afternoon after I'd picked up another packet of records. Off the record, she whispered, you're not the first person who's questioned Linda's paperwork. I looked at her carefully. Then why hasn't anyone done anything? Melissa sighed. Because every time someone pushes back, they settle, move out, or give up. Nobody has ever documented everything. That sentence gave me more motivation than she probably realized, so I documented everything. I built a timeline across my living room wall using painter's tape and index cards, complaint dates, notice dates, office hours, email timestamps, metadata, witnesses. Every new piece fit into place until the picture became impossible to ignore. Linda hadn't simply been overzealous. She'd been manufacturing violations first and justifying them afterward. The annual HOA meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday evening. Residents rarely attended unless dues were increasing, but word had quietly spread that I planned to challenge the fines publicly. By the time Hazel and I walked into the clubhouse, more than 40 homeowners had filled nearly every chair. Conversations stopped almost immediately. Linda stood near the front, wearing another perfectly pressed blazer, smiling confidently as if she expected this meeting to end the same way every disagreement before it had ended. With residents apologizing and paying whatever they were told to pay, she looked directly at me. Then, down at Hazel. Anne smirked. I hope you brought your checkbook, she said loud enough for several people nearby to hear. I smiled back, placed a thick, 3-ring binder on the front table, then set a small flash drive beside it without saying a single word. Her smile faded just enough for me to notice. For the first time since this nightmare had started, I wasn't the one walking into that room uncertain about what was about to happen. She was. And as the board president called the meeting to order and invited residents to address community concerns, I realized the next 15 minutes were about to decide far more than whether my service dog could stay. They were about to decide whether the truth still had a place in our neighborhood at all. When the board finally opened the floor for resident comments, I stood up, picked up my binder, and walked to the front without rushing. Hazel stayed right beside me, calm as always, completely unaware that she'd somehow become the center of the biggest fight this little community had seen in years. Linda leaned back in her chair with that same confident smile she'd worn every time she taped another violation notice to my door. Go ahead, she said. Let's hear why the rules shouldn't apply to you. I looked at her for a second, then turned toward everyone else instead. Actually, I said, I'm here because I think the rules should apply equally to everyone, including the people enforcing them. The room went quiet. I opened the binder and projected the first document onto the screen behind the board. This violation notice says it was issued at 2:14 in the afternoon, I explained, pointing to the timestamp. The complaint it references wasn't submitted until almost 5 hours later. A few heads turned toward Linda. She shifted in her chair but stayed silent. I flipped to the next page. This notice was supposedly created on a Sunday when the office was closed. Another page. This electronic signature is identical to one used on a different notice weeks later. Same file, same digital fingerprint. I wasn't speaking loudly, but I didn't need to. Every sentence landed a little harder than the one before it. Then I connected my flash drive and played the recording. Linda's voice filled the clubhouse. I don't have time to review every stack of medical papers people hand me. A pause. I glanced at it. That doesn't mean I have to believe everything doctors write. Nobody moved. Nobody coughed. Even the air conditioning suddenly sounded loud. I stopped the recording and quietly placed my phone back in my pocket. One of the board members, a retired attorney named Richard, asked Linda a simple question. Did you approve the accommodation before issuing these violations? Linda hesitated. I don't specifically remember. Richard looked down at the approval letter already sitting in front of him. Your signature is right here. Another board member, Denise, flipped through several pages before looking directly at Linda. These dates don't match. Why? Linda started talking quickly, saying the management office handled paperwork, residents manipulated records, computers made mistakes, and people were trying to undermine the board. The explanations became more desperate with every sentence. Finally, Melissa, the property manager, quietly stood up from the back of the room. I'd like the board to know, she said, that I warned multiple times these violations should not have been issued until the accommodation request was reviewed properly. You could almost hear the balance of power shift. Suddenly, neighbors who had stayed silent for years began raising their hands. Frank described receiving violations for repairs he'd already completed. The young couple talked about misleading photographs attached to their notices. Another resident admitted she paid hundreds of dollars simply because she was afraid of retaliation. Story after story poured out until it became obvious my case wasn't unusual. It was simply the first one someone had documented thoroughly enough to expose the pattern. The board recessed for a brief executive discussion. It felt like an hour even though it couldn't have been more than 10 minutes. Hazel rested her head against my leg while I stared out the clubhouse window, wondering if I'd done enough. Then the board returned. Richard cleared his throat, effective immediately. All violations issued regarding Ms. Parker's service animal are rescinded. All associated fines are permanently removed. Her accommodation remains fully recognized. He paused before continuing. The board also votes to remove Linda Mercer as HOA president pending an independent review of enforcement procedures and financial records. Linda's face lost every trace of confidence. She tried to interrupt, but nobody was listening anymore. Residents who had avoided eye contact with her for years simply watched in silence as she gathered her clipboard, stuffed a few papers into her bag with shaking hands, and walked out the side door without saying another word. I didn't celebrate. Honestly, I mostly felt tired. The kind of tired that settles into your bones after carrying fear for weeks. A few days later, I received a formal letter confirming every fine had been erased, along with an apology from the association's legal counsel. State housing officials also opened an inquiry into the handling of accommodation requests. And while I can't tell you everything that happened after that, I can tell you Linda never held another leadership position in our community again. Life slowly became ordinary, and after everything we'd been through, ordinary felt incredible. Every morning, Hazel still nudges my arm before I even realize an episode is coming. We still take the same walk around the pond, wave to the same neighbors, and sometimes Frank jokes that Hazel deserves an honorary seat on the HOA board because she's shown more integrity than some people ever did. Looking back, I don't think this story was really about a service dog. It was about what happens when small amounts of unchecked authority convince someone they're above the rules they expect everyone else to follow. The truth usually doesn't arrive with flashing lights or dramatic speeches. Sometimes it arrives quietly, inside timestamps, forgotten documents, and one person who's simply too stubborn to stop asking questions. So now I'd love to hear from you. Do you think Linda genuinely believed she was protecting the community, or do you think power had simply gone to her head? Have you ever dealt with an HOA, landlord, or manager who thought nobody would challenge them? Share your story down in the comments because I read every one of them. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stick around, because sometimes the smallest neighborhood disputes uncover the biggest truths.